I'm sitting here with Carmine DeSilvio, Global Chair and CEO of EY, who I think you probably all know, and Paul Tudor-Jones, who you also all know, Chair of Just Capital, to discuss a subject that both of them have a very important stake in, and that is the theme of the year, frankly, for Davos. It's suddenly stakeholder capitalism is on every banner on the promenade. The argument weirdly seems to be won. We need to explore this a little bit. Paul and I were at a dinner the night before last, on day 271 of the World Economic Forum, where I asked a room full of about 40 CEOs probably, at one point during this dinner, does anybody want to speak up for Milton Friedman for a moment? Because it seemed as though we were all just bought into the idea that shareholder value maximisation was so 2019, 2018, and not a single hand went up. And I have to say, I came away from that dinner thinking, is it really that easy? Paul, you've been doing this for a while now. You've been thinking about this challenge about how do you change the model of capitalism to make it more just. Do you feel it's suddenly gone from night to day like that?
Well, I think we've gone under the crest. And clearly, this year was momentous with the Business Roundtable's proclamation in August that reversed, if you'll remember, their 1997 dictum that said the purpose of a company is to serve its shareholders. And that kind of follows on. That was canonizing what Milton Friedman said in 1970, which is the purpose of a company is to maximize its profits. And from the day he said that, you got to realize when he said that, wealth inequality in the United States was 1/5 of what it is today. There was a reasonable sharing arrangement. 6% of revenues was the profit margin back then. Today that number is nearly 12%. So if you just think about it, again in broad terms, $2 trillion of profits last year in the United States economy. 50 years ago, $1 trillion of that would not have gone to shareholders. $1 trillion would have gone to employees, customers, communities, and the planet. And so you had a much more egalitarian, a much more distributed form of sharing. And the reason that we've got kind of this divisiveness that we have in the United States is because, and you're seeing it play out in the political arena, is because the sharing has become too skewed to what is an increasingly smaller and more wealthy 1%.
So, Carmine, you and your colleagues you're in and out of every, thousands of companies every day. How widespread do you think this new worldview is? Do you feel the argument's been won among the majority of your clients, or is it just a few people who sign letters for Business Roundtable?
It's look, we have not won yet by any means, but I do think the Business Roundtable was a great start, and 180 something CEOs signed up to that, and that's a big statement. Really, only a few that are part of the Business Roundtable did not. But yes, those are the largest corporations in the U.S. And so one of the things we were talking about is, what about one layer down? I think it's starting to get there, but there has to be a lot more, in particular, investors have to be part of this, and they have to be part of this in a big way because their expectations have to change. Investors, asset owners, asset gatherers, asset managers, and Larry Fink did a great thing with the letter he put out in terms of climate, but they have to start driving that it's not just shareholder return, but it's just capital, it's whatever you want to use the words, but that has to be a bigger focus, and it has to come from the owners.
You're the voice of the investors here, Paul. How much of a change have we seen already, and how important is the latest Larry's letter in accelerating?
Well, what I would say is, if we kind of rewind back to the 1960s, when you had a different sharing arrangement, you had GDP growth was, on average for that decade, is twice what we've experienced the past decade in the United States. You could make the argument that more equitable sharing would create a bigger pie where investors may not necessarily be penalized. If you just, I mean, here's an interesting thought. So, if we had had since 2000, if we had had the same sharing that was in effect in place for most of the 1900s till 1970. Since 2000, 5 trillion, that would have been the difference between 11% margin and 6% profit margin. 5 trillion would have gone, instead of to shareholders, would have gone to, again, employees, customers, communities, the planet. What would our economy be like if that capital was in active hands, distributed through income, say 150,000 and under, all the way down? What would our GDP growth be? Would it be 2.5, or would it be like it was in the 60s, 4.5 or 5? It's possible that overall returns, maybe the percentages might vary, but the overall returns might be just as good because we might have a much bigger pie. And of course, we won't know, but it's interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about. We always think, if we put the shareholder first, the trickle down, the economy's going to be better. Trickle down. I'm not so sure if not putting shareholders on even keel with the other stakeholders might not actually be for the larger social good.
If I can turn that question on its head quickly, what would our markets look like if every CEO woke up tomorrow and said, let's do a 6% margin instead of 11% margin that our investors have got used to? Are you kind of advocating that that turnaround, and what fallout would that have?
Well, look, it took us 50 years to screw this up, right? I don't think we're going to change it overnight, but I do think, and certainly that dinner we were at, now that was a PayPal dinner, and Dan Schulman's, he's one hell of a CEO, right? He just flat out said, the most important thing for me is my employees. If I start with them, if I put my employees first, well then I'm going to have a great product for my customers. And my customers are going to respond with tremendous sales. And I'm going to have great profits, and my shareholders are going to be happy. So it's interesting. I think it's not going to happen overnight, but I think we're on the right path to a much happier society.
So if we're on this path, it feels as though this week is all about how do we get down to the nitty-gritty. We've had this big sweeping debate, some very symbolically important kind of pledges of change. But now there's a little impatience for action already. Just 6 months after the Business Roundtable letter came out, and we all went, wow. Then it's kind of, well, guys, what's changed? What role do you and your peer group play in a company like EY in getting down to the nitty-gritty?
Yeah, so yesterday we had the International Business Council meeting that was chaired by Barry Moynihan as part of WEF, and the whole conversation was around getting to the nitty-gritty, Andrew, to your point. There was a lot of conversation. The whole introduction was, we've done a lot of talking, and Davos is famous for a lot of talking. We need to really move into action on a lot of these items. And what does action mean? So we did go through, we at EY as well as the other big four worked on a set of metrics for WEF, for the IBC. It's 22 metrics that we believe all companies should be focused on in terms of stakeholder capitalism. And it goes from prosperity, which Paul talks a lot about, to human capital, governance, and the environment. And those are the 4 categories. We actually all took one of each. The big four took one category, and we tried to combine all the different metrics that are out there from SASB and GRI and so forth. And so at this meeting, we went through in some detail the metrics themselves, all the work that's been done, And then Brian basically did a poll, electronic poll of the CEOs, and I'd say maybe there were about probably 80, 90 CEOs in the room, on how many of them would sign up to this today. And I would say there were a couple different questions, but I would say probably somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 electronically agreed. And the concept here is that the same way the Business Roundtable put out this statement, I think the CEOs are going to be asked to sign to these metrics. Now, they're not perfect. There's nuances to them. But to me, we have to start somewhere. This gets into action versus words.
Yeah.
So now, you can't tell, that people were just happy on their little electronic device, and when it really comes down to it, will they sign? But there seemed to be very good momentum. So if we can get started on something like that, I do think that will change, that'll put us into action.
So, okay, so we're on to metrics.
Well, you want to talk about action, so I gave you something that's more tangible. We could talk
we get excited. Action movers at the FT include metrics. That's our idea of action. Paul, this debate has not been short of metrics for the last several years. We have SASB, we have GRI, we have TCFD, we have every acronym that I've forgotten. Is that what we need right now, or are people just drowning in metrics?
Well, I think what we lacked was awareness, and I think what we have gotten over the last really 12 to 24 months is an understanding about all these relationships. And so the metrics are really important. I do think you can kind of distill it down to a couple of them. At Just Capital, we poll the American public every year. American public has told us year after year after year, the single most important thing to determining just behavior by a company is how you pay and treat your employees. That's by far and away the most important thing. So the idea that we're going to have a metric that highlights and makes transparent what companies pay their employees is the single most important deliverable. And the reason why it's so important is we've done some preliminary work. We're going to do a little bit more, and I would say, and again I'm going to put this in parentheses, we think that of the Russell 1000, 20 million employees, 10 million are not making, in the United States, they have full-time jobs, are not making a living wage. So let's say that...
And that's this is not the sort of podunk companies.
No, this is top 1,000
companies.
Top 1,000 companies.
Half their employees are not making it.
And what I'd like to do is, again, I don't want to go necessarily on the record with that yet. We want to do a little more work on that. But it's certainly at least 5 million. And living wage is defined as what do you need? Basic food, housing, and minimal medical just to be able to survive without a government subsidy. And that's, I think, the most important point, without a government subsidy, because if you think about it, you've got a variety of companies who will employ people, pay them below a living wage, and obviously a living wage is different depending upon what part of the country you're in, pay them below a living wage, and then effectively what they're doing is they're depending upon the tax base of that community and the federal government to fill that gap. So, to me, the single most important metric, because I think everyone needs to know that, particular communities, taxpayers need to know, I've got this company that wants to come to my community. What does this wage profile look like? Is it actually being added to my community, or is it a drain on community? And so that's why the wage data and making that transparent is really important.
Before I go to Carmine again, can I just ask you, for people in the room who don't know the Just Capital rankings, how high up the rankings does shareholder return come in? Ordinary people,
So we've distilled it down into 29 components. Number one, at 8% is pay a fair wage. 2 is ethical leadership, which surprised me, but are you leading your company ethically and morally? And number 3 is, are you paying a living wage? So, and that's about 6%. So 2 of the top 3 have to deal with really what you're paying your employees and the leadership that you're providing that company. The 29th metric at 1.2% is what kind of return are you making for your shareholder? So
Right.
again, we have this enormous divide in the country because the public wants one thing, but the C-suite is delivering something different because they've got a gun to their head by a variety of people who historically are pushing returns.
So there's a tension there, isn't there, Carmine? The public may be saying shareholders don't matter, but they still do matter to any CEO, any board of directors. Do you think the argument has been won that all of this can be done for stakeholders without it coming at a cost for shareholders?
Look, my answer to that question, Andrew, is always this is an and issue. We're not saying, and I don't think the DRT is saying that it's about everything else, but it's not about shareholder return. Shareholder return is part of this, but all the items factor into the long-term health of a company, and that's really the key here, is to look at things for the long term. And this is one of the things that we've been arguing around. Quarterly predictions, quarterly results. We have to try to get away from that, and it's not easy because, as I said earlier, I'm not even sure that asset managers, asset owners are driving that. But to me, analysts, you get on any analyst call, that's what they're driving. Now, it's changing. More and more companies on investor days, first thing on their slide deck these days is actually climate. Climate is becoming the first thing on that they want to talk about. That was not happening 6 months ago, a year ago, especially in the U.S. In Europe, it was. So I do think, Andrew, it's changing, but it can't be, no one cares about shareholder returns.
Can I just?
Yep.
I think the most important thing is, yes, I do think the sharing will be lower for investors, but we have to think about the tail risks that threaten the current sharing arrangement. One tail risk is climate. So clearly, all of us, including companies, are going to have to fall into line and pay to minimize that tail risk, or there will be no shareholders. Another tail risk is the enormous wealth disparity and the huge number of left behind in the United States, which is posing a political tail risk, which again will severely impair shareholder returns depending upon whether we try to solve this top down through higher taxation from government. So yes, we are going to have a new sharing arrangement, and it will be in the long run best interest of shareholders to have that new sharing arrangement, and possibly the pie might be bigger to diminish the negative aspects of that.
How much of this is about business trying to get ahead of government regulation, do you think?
I actually don't think it's business trying to get ahead. It's business filling a void, because I do think, government. Look, I'm a believer in capitalism, and I do believe business needs to do more. In some situations, I think there's been a void. And you talk about climate. I do think there's a role for government to play in climate, because if we're really going to solve the climate problem, economically, there has to be incentives to solve it, and government could play in those incentives. But in many, I think, again, in Europe is ahead on this. In the U.S., I think government has not played that role. So business now, I think, is saying, you know what, we have to play a bigger role.
Do we need, though, the SEC to be saying this is how you account for stakeholders
Well,
decades ago, profit and loss?
Personally, Andrew, I don't think the SEC is going to say that now. But I do think the more we can at least get moving on some of these standards voluntarily, the more we can move to something that maybe at some point there'll be more, standardization, SEC regulation.
Paul, is it all going to be done by business, or will the government have a voice here?
The current government won't have a voice in it. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing this movement here in Davos and you're seeing businesses respond is because I think we all recognize that, again, our current system of capitalism is not necessarily working at its optimized potential. And so you're seeing, I do think you're seeing CEOs, investors, the whole financial community, the whole corporate community recognize we've got to do something and we're going to do it ourselves. And so for me, it's heartening. Again, if I look now, admittedly, that was that was the wrong sample size because of those were all converts that we were at two nights ago. But that was really, really heartening, right? I mean, you heard from those women and men a completely changed attitude to the way that they're going to run and manage their companies. And I think they're going to be leaders. I think they're bellwethers. And I think we're going to find out that the rest of the companies won't fall into line behind them.
Carmine, what are the hurdles? You know, if we're all gathered here in a year and it didn't pan out in the way that we feel the momentum is it's taking us in a certain direction, but it doesn't take us there. What do you think we'll look back and say, oh well, that's what stopped it?
Some of it, Andrew, honestly, some of it's just pure inertia. Change is hard. This is change. This is change. It's change on how we look at things. Companies themselves have to change processes, and change is hard. So you're going to need leadership that's going to have to drive change, and that's not easy. And so that, like everything else, you talk about buy-in. I do think there is buy-in on many of what we're talking, many of the things we're talking about. I do think climate, in particular, is in a different place today than it was. Paul and I were talking earlier with you 6 months ago, 8 months ago. I mean, I tell the story. I talk to a lot of our clients, a lot of CEOs, and in Europe, climate has always been, the last whatever years, has been a conversation that we have all the time. In the U.S., I would say it started about 6 to 8 months ago, where all of a sudden conversations with CEOs, client CEOs, climate started coming into the picture. And I had a conversation with a U.S. CEO of Fortune 200, I guess, and it was right after Thanksgiving, and he asked me, so what are all CEOs talking about and so forth, and I said actually, even in the U.S. now, more and more people are talking about climate, and what are we doing around climate, and what are companies doing around climate, and this is in his executive dining room, we were having lunch, and so he started to laugh. So I was a little paranoid, why is he laughing at me? It's like, no, I'm not laughing at you. He said, I'm laughing because this was my entire conversation with my kids at Thanksgiving. And so his kids were 30, 27, 23 years old. His oldest one is married, and at the Thanksgiving table, they talked about climate. And his kids were demanding that he do more, that they all do more. And he said, by the end of Thanksgiving weekend, we had agreed that we as a family were going to be carbon neutral. And we were going to save, wherever we can. And then if we couldn't get there, we'd have to do something in terms of buying offsets. He goes, of course, I'm the one who has to go buy the offsets. But it was an interesting conversation.
So the two most
that is not a conversation that was had a year ago, year and a half ago.
So now we know the two most important weeks in the calendar are Davos and Thanksgiving for moving this debate forward.